Welcome to our first section. In this section, we'll take a very first look at React. So we're gonna talk about why we need something like React in the first place, what exactly React is, and how it compares to vanilla JavaScript. Then, to finish, we're gonna discuss different options for setting up a new React application, and then use a tool called Create React App to build our very first React project. So, are you ready? Then let's get started. Now, before we start learning about React, let's actually ask ourselves one very important question. Why do front-end frameworks like React actually exist in the first place? Why not simply use vanilla JavaScript to build our apps? Well, let's answer that question in this lecture. And we're gonna start at the very beginning by reviewing how websites used to be built in the past, how we transitioned to a new way, and how that led to the rise of front-end frameworks. So, back in the day, before around 2010, all websites were always rendered on the server. So in server-side rendering, a website is basically assembled on the backend, so on a web server, based on data and templates. The resulting HTML, CSS, and JavaScript code is then sent to the client side, so to the web browser that requested the page. The browser then simply takes this code and basically paints it onto the screen. And a typical example of server-side rendered websites are all websites built with WordPress. Now, the JavaScript that used to be included in these websites was initially only to add some simple dynamics to the page, like simple animations, hover effects, and other stuff like that. And usually, a very popular library at the time called jQuery was used for this, because it made JavaScript work the exact same way across all browsers back then. However, over time, developers started writing more and more JavaScript code to be executed by the browser, until at some point these became fully fledged web applications, which then led to the rise of so-called single-page applications. So these are basically web pages that are rendered on the client, not on the server. So in client-side rendering, basically the work of rendering a web page is shifted from the server to the client. And so now we don't call these web pages anymore, but web applications. Now, a web application still needs data, which usually comes from the backend in the form of an API. And I'm sure you have already worked with APIs like that, right? So the application consumes this API data and renders a screen for each view of the application. And these single-page applications essentially feel as if you were using a native desktop or phone application. So you can click on links or submit forms without the page ever reloading. So you're technically always on the same page, and therefore the name single-page app. Now, just before leaving this slide, I want to quickly mention that server-side rendering is actually making a comeback right now. So it's slowly getting modern again, driven by frameworks that are built on top of modern client-side rendering frameworks, such as Next.js, Remix, and many others. But in either case, we still need to learn how to build single-page applications, of course. But do we want to do so with vanilla JavaScript? Well, actually no, we do not want that, because there are actually several problems with using vanilla JavaScript to build large-scale applications, as we will see in a moment. But first, let's establish that building any front-end application is really all about handling data and then displaying that data in a nice user interface. That's basically all a web application does, if you think about it. So it receives data, changes the data as the user uses the app, and it always displays the current data on the screen. What this means is that the most important task of a single-page app, and really of any application and website, is to keep the user interface in sync with the data. Or in other words, is to make sure that the UI always displays the current state of the data. Now, as it turns out, displaying the correct data and making sure that it stays correct over time is actually a really hard problem to solve. And to understand why that is, let's take a look at this Airbnb application. So in this interface, we can identify a few pieces of data. First, we have this list of apartment. Then we have a search bar. We have some data about the filters that are being applied. And we also have this piece of data here, which indicates whether the search should be updated as the user moves the map. And all this is data that the app depends on, right? And actually, in the real world Airbnb application, there is just so much data. So this list here is not even all of it. But anyway, as we know, all of this data needs to be always kept in sync with the user interface and also with the other pieces of data, because they are all kind of interconnected. For example, when we change the data about location or dates, then the UI needs to show those new dates, and also the list of apartments needs to be updated. Or another example, the map needs to show the location of the apartments, and so therefore, when the apartments change, the map must also change. And the same thing should happen the other way around. So when the map is moved, the list of apartments should change as well, but only when the user has previously clicked on the green checkbox. So these pieces of data here are even more interconnected, and it can become a real mess. Now, just as a side note, in a real-world app, we call each of these pieces of data a piece of state. So based on these examples I showed you, I would say that without a framework, it would be virtually impossible to keep this huge amount of data in sync with this super complex UI. But still, you might be wondering why? Why would it be so hard to build something like this with vanilla JavaScript? Well, it comes down to two big aspects. The first is that building a complex front-end with vanilla JavaScript alone requires large amounts of direct DOM traversing and manipulation. Like in this code right here, where we have manual element selection, class toggling, DOM traversing, and even manipulation of text and CSS styles. And this is guaranteed to become an absolute nightmare in a complex app like Airbnb, because our code would be extremely complex and really hard to understand, and we would probably just end up with a huge mess of entangled spaghetti code. So this is the first problem. The second big problem is that in typical vanilla JavaScript apps, state such as simple text or numbers are oftentimes simply stored right in the DOM. So right in the HTML elements themselves, rather than in a central place in the application. The result is that we end up with many parts of the app accessing and changing that DOM state directly, which makes the spaghetti code even harder to understand, and even worse, it will most certainly introduce many bugs into our application. And no one wants bugs, right? Now, of course, you could try to solve these problems on your own, but then you will just end up creating your own framework, which will most likely be way worse than all the well-established frameworks that already exist. So at this point, you might as well just use a battle-tested framework like React. Alright, so now that we know why it's so hard to write a single-page app with just JavaScript, we can answer the fundamental question that we asked in the beginning. So, why do front-end frameworks actually exist? Well, we kind of already answered that question over the course of this lecture. So, the big fundamental reason why these frameworks exist is because keeping a user interface in sync with data is really hard, and it's a lot of work too. So basically, frameworks like Angular, React, or Vue take this hard work of synchronizing data with the user interface away from us developers. So they solve this really hard problem so that we developers can focus only on the data and on building our user interfaces themselves. Now, different frameworks have different approaches to doing this, but they are all similar in the fact that they keep UI and data in sync over time. Now, another extremely valuable thing that frameworks give us is the fact that they basically enforce a correct way of structuring and writing code. So essentially, the authors of each of these frameworks came up with a good way of structuring applications so that other developers can then follow these conventions as well to build better applications with, hopefully, a lot less spaghetti code. Finally, frameworks give developers, and especially teams, a consistent way of building web applications. This way, everyone on the team will build their part of the app in the exact same style as everyone else, which will, in the end, create a more consistent codebase and product. And there you go. This is why modern web development is all about JavaScript frameworks. Now, to get a first feeling for how React keeps the user interface in sync with state, let's quickly compare the Advice app that we built in the first section with a vanilla JavaScript implementation of the same application. So here I have them open side by side, and if you want to follow along, I actually added this vanilla javascript.html file right into the same code sandbox that we used to build this first Advice app. So right here in the source folder, there is now this vanilla.js, or actually vanilla-.html file. And again, I will post the link to this code sandbox into this lecture. All right, so in case you don't really remember what we did back here, you can always pause the video and just analyze this code here for a second for yourself. So what I want to do now, again, is to just quickly compare the React code that we wrote before with this vanilla JavaScript. Now, ironically, this vanilla JavaScript implementation is actually in an HTML file. So I placed all the HTML file and then also the JavaScript right into one HTML file just to keep it all in the same place. But already this shows us the very first difference between the two philosophies. So here, everything is basically done in JavaScript. So even the JSX, so basically this kind of HTML here, is written inside of JavaScript. So JavaScript is taking care of everything, while here in the vanilla JavaScript, HTML is still in charge. So we have an HTML file, and that HTML file is then including the JavaScript into it. So it's basically the other way around, right? So right inside this HTML, we still have our same h1 here for the advice. The only difference is that it's empty, while here we include that advice state. Then we have the button and the paragraph for the message. Then inside of the script, so inside of the JavaScript part, we need to, of course, then manually select all of these three DOM elements. So I selected the advice element, the button, and also this one here for the count. And so for that, all of them needed to have this class. While here, well, we don't need any of that. There's no class here in any of these elements. And also we are nowhere manually selecting them, right? So then next we have this getAdvice function, which we will get to in a minute. And then we still basically have two pieces which we can call like state. So we have a count value, which starts at 0, and an advice. And so these are exactly the same as here, these states. Then finally, in the end, we also attach an event listener. So this getAdvice function right here. So we attach that to the button that we selected here manually before. While here in the JSX, we do it using this onClick attribute right here. So right off the bat, you see immediately that we need to do a lot of things manually over here that here happen more automatically. And again, that here it is really the JavaScript that is in charge of everything, while here it is still the HTML. But anyway, let's now get here to the heart of the application, which is really this getAdvice function. So just like here in our React implementation, we start by getting the data, and then we update the service, or actually the advice, and the count values that we defined down here, right? So we're updating the count here and the advice right here. However, simply updating these two values will of course do nothing. So the user interface will not change by us updating these JavaScript values. While here, in this React example, as soon as we update the advice and the count state, automatically React kept the user interface in sync with these two values. And so that's basically the big message that we got from the previous lecture, right? So that React and all these other front-end frameworks are really good at keeping the data automatically in sync with the user interface. And again, that's exactly what's happening here. All we care about here is to set the new data, and that's all we do. React is the one who automatically takes care of updating the user interface without us having to do anything. But here, of course, in the vanilla JavaScript implementation, we need to manually do that. So we need to manually keep the data in sync with the UI. So we have the data here, and then we use that data to update the DOM manually. So we come here to our count element and the advice element that we also manually selected previously, and we change their text content property, which is just normal DOM manipulation. So then here we set this one to the count variable and this one to the advice variable. And this really is a fundamental difference and a fundamental shift in how we build front-end applications. Now, you might argue that in this very small example, doing this is not a lot of work, and maybe it might not even be necessary to learn React. And I would agree with you that we would, of course, not need React to build something really small and simple, such as this. But as soon as we get just a little bit bigger than this, it starts kind of getting out of control. So we would have to select tons of elements, and we would really need to create a lot of extra code that with React we don't have to. Again, because it automatically takes care of keeping the data in sync with the user interface. That's really the main thing that I want you to keep in mind from this lecture and from the previous one. So of course, feel free to analyze all the differences that exist here in this code, because just with this, you can really see the two different philosophies at work. I'm not going to go even deeper into this at this point, but it would be pretty interesting if you take a few minutes and really compare what's going on this side here and on the React implementation. And so once you're done doing that, it's now time to finally learn what React actually is in a bit more detail. So hopefully I see you right in the next lecture soon. So now that we know why we need a JavaScript framework in the first place, let's start by learning about the most popular framework out there, React. So in this lecture, we will get a high-level overview of what React actually is and how it works. So it's gonna be a full-packed but super interesting lecture, so let's quickly get started. So, according to the official React documentation, React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. Now that's something, but it really isn't that helpful, is it? So let's extend this definition by a bit so that it becomes more helpful, or should I say, a little bit more crazy. Like this. So now, in this slightly modified definition, React is an extremely popular, declarative, component-based, state-driven JavaScript library for building user interfaces, created by Facebook. And this is actually a lot more helpful, because now we can deconstruct this definition and learn about what React actually is, step by step. So, starting with component-based design, React is all about components, such as buttons, input fields, search bars, and so on. So components are the building blocks of user interfaces in React. And in fact, basically all React does is to take components and draw them on a web page. That's it. And so we build complex UIs in React by building multiple components and then combining these components like Lego pieces, for example, to create a complex application like Airbnb. So here we have exactly the same components that we saw earlier, but all combined into a complex UI. So the nav bar, the search bar, the results panel, and the map. Now another thing that we do with components is to reuse them. For example, here in the results panel, there are multiple listings that look quite similar, and so we can create a listing component and then reuse it 3 times here, simply adjusting the data a little bit. Now, since we build complex UIs by combining multiple components, each component must have all the information about what it looks like, right? So, in order to describe what each component looks like and how it works, we use a special declarative syntax called JSX. And declarative simply means that we tell React what a component, and ultimately the entire UI, should look like based on the current state. So React is basically a huge abstraction away from the DOM, so that we never have to work with the DOM directly as we would with vanilla JavaScript. So we simply tell React what we want to happen when some data changes, but not how to do it. And again, we do that using JSX. So JSX is basically a syntax that combines parts of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and it even allows us to reference other React components. And the declarative nature of React is an essential concept that, of course, we will really dive into later. But now you might wonder, if we never touch the DOM, then how does React update the UI? Well, that's where the concept of state comes into play. So remember that the main goal of React is to always keep the UI in sync with data. And from now on, let's actually call that data state. For example, an array of apartments on Airbnb. So based on our initial state, React will render a user interface using the components that we wrote using JSX. Then, based on some event like a button click, the state might change. For example, more data about apartments might be loaded from an API. And so here comes the interesting part. Whenever the state changes, we manually update the state in our app, and React will then automatically re-render the user interface to reflect that latest state. Or, in other words, React reacts to state changes by re-rendering the UI. And that is, in fact, the whole reason why React is called React in the first place. Now, there's always been some debate over whether React is actually a framework or just a library. Well, the short answer is that React is actually just a library, even though I keep calling it a framework. And the reason for that is that React itself is really only the so-called view layer. So if we want to build a complete real-world application, we need to choose multiple external libraries to add to our project, for example, for routing or for data fetching. Now, to address this, there are actually multiple frameworks that have been built on top of React. So frameworks that include all these functionalities that React is missing out of the box. And the most popular ones are called Next.js and Remix. But again, more about all that later in the course. Now, moving on, besides all the great features that we've been talking about, maybe the biggest reason to choose React over all the other frameworks that are similar is because React is extremely popular. So, according to the weekly download numbers from NPM, React is by far the most used framework, and the difference between React and the other ones only seems to be growing. So React really isn't going anywhere. A big reason for that is that many large companies have adopted React a long time ago, and so now more and more smaller companies all over the world are following in their footsteps. This means that all these companies now need React developers for their teams, which of course has created a huge worldwide job market with a high demand for qualified React developers. And these are not just any jobs, they are usually well-paying jobs. Now, even another positive outcome of React's huge popularity is that now there is a very large and active React developer community, which means that there are always going to be lots of tutorials, Stack Overflow questions and answers, and also lots of support given to other React developers. And if you ask me, this is actually one of the strongest benefits of using React right now. Also because this huge community has grown a truly gigantic third-party library ecosystem around React. And so now you can integrate countless useful libraries and tools into your own React applications. And now our last topic is that React was created by Facebook. Well, more specifically, React was created in 2011 by Jordan Walke, who is an engineer who was working at Facebook at the time. So that's why we say that React is backed by Facebook, or now by Meta. So there, React was first used on the newsfeed and also the chat app, and from there it spread out to the entire Facebook and also the Instagram applications. Then, in 2013, React was open sourced for everyone to use it, and the rest is history. Because React has truly and completely transformed front-end web development, not only by developers that are using React itself, but because many other modern frameworks were created as a response, which really changed the industry forever. Okay, so to summarize, React is really good at two things. First, rendering components on a web page as a user interface based on their current state. And second, React is really good at keeping the user interface in sync with state by re-rendering, or in other words, by reacting when the state of one of the component changes. And as you will see later, React does all this by employing something called a virtual DOM, a fiber tree, one-way data flow, and many other techniques that we will study throughout this course. Alright, and so now that you have a rough overview of what React actually is, let's set up our development environment so that we can start writing some serious code finally. Now, before we start coding and learn all about React, let's quickly set up our development environment in this lecture. Now, since you're taking this course, I'm assuming that you already did some coding before, and therefore you will already have some code editor installed on your computer. And if that code editor is VS Code, then congratulations, you're already using the best code editor out there. But if you're using some other code editor, then I would highly recommend you to download VS Code simply by downloading the installer from here and then installing it just like any other application. And by doing so, you can then customize the editor just like I do in this course, which will make it a little bit easier for you to follow everything. Next up, of course, we need a web browser to actually run the applications that we are going to build. And I'm using Google Chrome for that. And so I highly encourage you to use the same browser so that our results are going to look the same. So if you don't have it installed yet, then make sure to do that right now. And finally, we are going to need to install Node.js on our system. And this is not because we will do some Node.js development, but it's simply because all the tools that we're going to use run on Node.js. And it's important that you use at least Node version 18. And so if you're not sure about which version you are currently running, or if maybe you never installed Node.js before, then please go ahead and download it here from this first button. And it doesn't matter if it's Node 18 or 20 or 22 or whatever, because of course this Node version will change in the future, but what matters is that it is at least version 18. Okay, and with these three tools in place, let's now configure VS Code a little bit. So open up a new VS Code window, which will then look something like this. So it might have changed a bit in the future, but basically it will look something like this. And so here from the left sidebar, let's now install two essential extensions. The first one is ESLint, which is a code linter. So basically a program that will automatically find errors in our code or find some best practices that we're violating. And maybe you have already used this linter before, but if not, really make sure to download it. It's really popular with over 25 million installs. Then another extension that we really need is Prettier, because Prettier will automatically format our code. For example, to remove empty lines and stuff like that. And this is really important for you to follow this course because it will make your code look exactly the same as my code in the videos. And so that will help you find any bugs that you might have created. So please go ahead and download this extension here. And if we need any more extensions throughout the course, we will then just install them as we go. Now, about the color theme that I'm using here, it is called One Monokai. So that's this one down here. So again, if you want your editor to look just like mine, then just go ahead, download it here, and then set the color theme. You can also do that down here. All right. Now, besides this overall color theme, I also use a theme for the file icons in the file tree. And so that one's called Material Icons. And so make sure to download this one as well, and then set this file icon theme, which again, you can also do it down here. All right, so with this, we tweaked the appearance of our VS Code a little bit. And of course, you can go ahead and install as many extensions as you'd like, but I will now move on to set some settings. So that's very important as well. And the first one is the autosave setting. So you can just search that here. And probably this is already the default, but I'm not really sure. So just make sure to set autosave to on focus change, which will ensure that your code gets saved each time that you go to a different tab or to a different window. Next time, we need to now set the Prettier extension that we installed as our default formatter. So that's this setting right here. So make sure to set it here to Prettier Code Formatter. So otherwise, sometimes VS Code doesn't know how to activate Prettier. And then also we want to tell VS Code to do this formatting on save. So let's search for the setting format on save, and then let's simply turn this on right here. Then about ESLint, we can set the ESLint run setting here and set it to on save. So basically, by default, ESLint will run each time that you type a new character, which might be a bit too much. And so by setting this here, ESLint will only check our code each time that we save it, which usually is more than enough. But of course, if you want, you can also leave the default, which is on type. Okay, so that's all the settings that we need. Next up, let's quickly make sure that you actually have Node.js installed now. And so for that, let's open up a new terminal, which I like to do using this shortcut that you should see up here on the screen. And so then to check your Node version, just type node-v. And so make sure again that your Node version is at least version 18. And if not, just go ahead and install it once again. All right, and now to finish, let's just set up some snippets. So snippets are basically some pieces of predefined code that we can use to greatly speed up development. So I actually prepared a file of 3 snippets that we're going to use a lot. And they are here in these starter files that we downloaded from GitHub right in the first section. So make sure to open it up. And this file is right here in the very first folder called setup. So let's open this file here, for example, by dragging and dropping it here onto this VS Code icon. But if for some reason that doesn't work for you, you can of course always just open it here the normal way. Right? Then just select everything and copy it. So copy this entire code and then come down here to user snippets. All right. And then it might be that you already have some snippets file. And so in that case, you can just open one of them. But if not, just go ahead and create a new snippets file by clicking here on this option. So I will just use this one that I already have. And let's just pretend that it's empty. So I will just empty it out. And then I will copy paste that code from here to here. So what we have here are 3 snippets. This one is to easily create a console.log. This one is to create a React functional component. So that's what this RFC stands for. And this one is for a React styled component. And we will see what these do later. So for example, this first one here, to just print to the console, will be activated each time that we type CL in a JavaScript, a TypeScript, or a React file. And it will then replace that CL with this console.log. And it will also then place the cursor between these parentheses, which is going to be really useful. So this is really powerful stuff. And again, we will come back to these other 2 and use them later. Okay, and with this, we're actually done. So we're all set up to now move on to finally start learning React and to start writing our own code. So hopefully I see you soon in the next lecture. Now, just for fun, I want to show you how we can write React code without any modern tooling and any build step. So right inside a regular HTML file. So this is what I call pure React, and it will show you why the tools that we will talk about next are so helpful. So to start, let's create our very first project folder, which I'm doing right here on the desktop, where I also have the GitHub files that we downloaded in the first section of the course. But of course, you can do this anywhere you want. And I'm simply going to call this first one 01 pure React. All right. And now all we have to do is to open up this folder as a project folder in VS Code. And one way of doing that is to drag and drop this folder onto the VS Code icon down here. Or of course, you can open up the project folder here from this menu or simply here. So here, open folder. So right now we have an empty folder. So let's create index.html. And to scaffold an empty HTML structure in VS Code, we can simply write the exclamation mark, hit enter, and then we have an empty HTML structure. So let's give it a title, Hello React. And then here in the body, all I will do for now is to create a div with the ID of root. And it could be any ID here, of course, but root is the standard for React. And we will place nothing in here. So give it a save, and maybe you noticed how Prettier automatically formatted the code as I saved it. Okay, so let's now add React to this file. And the way we do that when we write pure React is by simply including the React library as a script. Now, to get the URL of those scripts, we can actually check out React's official documentation. So to do that, let's head over to our browser and then check out react.dev. So that's the official React website, and we will explore it a little bit in a future video. But for now, let's just come here to this learn part. And then right here, let's select installation. So right on this page, then you will find this small part here, which says try React locally. And then here, let's click on this link here that says download this HTML page. Now, if for some reason that link there doesn't exist anymore in the future, then you can just try to write these 2 things here by hand, because it is these 2 scripts that we're now gonna add to our HTML file. Okay, so let's move back to VS Code and paste them right here. And with this, we have actually included React into this, let's say, project. Now again, usually when we write React, we do not do this, but instead we use a modern build tool, such as the ones that we are going to talk about next. But for now, we're doing it the pure way, just so you see why we actually need those tools. Now, in case you're wondering why we have two libraries here, it's because this first one here is basically the core React library. So this one is the one that works with components, state, and really all the React stuff. So this is basically the interface of how to interact with React. And then this other one here, so React DOM, is basically the rendering layer which can render React components into the DOM. And so since we want to render in the browser, we need to use React DOM. But React can actually be rendered in other environments, for example, as native applications using React Native. But anyway, let's now create our very first component. And of course, that also needs to happen inside a script, because that is also JavaScript. And so after these two scripts here, where we include the React library, let's open up another script. And then in there, we can create a function, and I will call it app, just like this. So remember from the very first app that we built that React is based on components. And a component is basically just a function that starts with an uppercase like this. And so now from this function here, we can return whatever we want to see on the UI. Now in that first application that we built, we returned some JSX code. Remember that? However, that is not going to work here because, well, we don't have the tooling that can convert JSX back to JavaScript. And so here we need to use the create element function. So let's do return react.create element and then simply the name of the HTML element. So let's say we want a header. So this React object here is the one that's coming from this script right here. So this script will give us this React object, and so from there we can then use this create element method. And if all this is really confusing to you right now, then please don't worry. So again, the goal here is really not for you to understand React at this point. We're just doing some experiments and just getting a first look at React here, but we are not really learning it yet. All right? So I'm really just trying to demonstrate here how we write pure React without a build tool. But anyway, let's now actually go back to that folder here and open index.html in Google Chrome just to see what happens. And let's inspect and close down this. I'll make it just a bit bigger here for you. And so this is just to show you that right now, actually nothing happened. So we still only have this root div and then of course our scripts. And so the reason why that header that we created is not here yet is because we didn't tell React to actually render it onto the page. So basically to place that header into the DOM. And so let's now go back and do that. And we do this here right at the very end, so after the component. So let's create a so-called root. And so here now we need that React DOM library that I mentioned before. So this one here. So from React DOM, we now do create root. And now we simply need to select this div element right here. So this div here, this element will become the root of our application, which means that the application will be rendered inside of this element. So basically right here. So let's simply select that with document.getElementById, which is just normal DOM manipulation, or in this case, just normal selecting elements using DOM methods. So we created our root, and now we can do root.render, and then again react.createElement app. So here is where our app component comes into play. So we render, basically creating a new element out of this app component. And once again, please don't memorize any of this. All right, this is just to show you. So if you wanted, you didn't even have to write this code. It would be perfectly fine just watching me. But still, I think it's probably a good idea to just start typing a bit of code. But anyway, when I reload this now, we should see a header element here. So remember, it's inside this root. And yeah, there it is. Now it's empty because we didn't actually place any content in it, but React did render this header right here. So this header element inside our DOM. And so let's now actually add something in there. Now the way this works is a bit confusing. So this createElement function does not only accept the name of the HTML element, but also so-called props, which in this case are null, and then as a third argument, the children of this element. And in this case, let's just write it as a string. Let's just do hello React. Give it a save. Let's go back. And yeah, there we go. Beautiful. So now this hello React is basically a child node of this header node right here. But let's go back. And yeah, as I mentioned before, we used JSX to write this, and then we wouldn't have to write this weird thing right here. We would just write it as HTML, basically, but that doesn't work here. And so that's one more reason why we do not write pure React like this in a real development environment. But anyway, right here in this function, we can, of course, just write any normal JavaScript logic. So let's, for example, create a string of the current time. So that's new date. And of course, this has nothing to do with React. To locale time string. And then let's add that here into the string, and we can just use a template literal for that. And in case you're not familiar with that for some reason, there is the next section in which I will explain all the essential JavaScript that we need for React. All right, but here let's just place now this time. Let's say it's, and then whatever the time is right now. Let's go back, and you see that we always have to manually reload the page. And of course, that also will disappear as soon as we start using some modern tooling. But anyway, here now we have our time. And as a last small thing in this application, what I want to do is to now update this every second with the new time, which then basically will make this function as a clock. So let's go back and let's do that. And for that, we need the concept of state. So maybe you remember from the first app that we built that state is necessary whenever we want to update something on the screen. But of course, we will go really deep into what state is and how it works a bit later in the course. For now, let's just create a new piece of state, and then we don't need this anymore, actually. So let's say const, and again calling it time, and then set time, which is a function with which we can update that time state. So then we need to say react.useState, and again, the React object is that big object that we got here from this script. And then here we need to set the default value. And so that's then going to be this. Let's paste that here, give it a save. And if we update now, it will look just exactly the same. So there's no updating yet. So it of course simply reflects the current time now. Okay, so let's go back and basically have it update every second. So for that, we need something called an effect. So react.useEffect, and we also did that in the first app. And now in here, inside this effect, we will simply use the JavaScript setInterval function. So this is not a React function, but it's simply a JavaScript function that we're going to use to set up a timer that every second will update this time state here. So setInterval also needs a function, and we could use arrow functions here to make it a bit shorter, but never mind. So this function should run every 1000 milliseconds, so once a second, and what should happen each time, so each time that this function here will be executed, is that the time should be set. So set time, and then again this, because this will then always be the new current time. So paste that here. And now finally here we need to define this empty array. And this will all make sense once we start learning about effects. But for now, just copy the code like this. And this should now already work. So let's check it out. Of course, we need to again manually update. And yeah, beautiful. So we have a working clock that we coded only with React. You see down here that the DOM is actually updated in this place once every second. And so that's the work of React. Nice. Now, this, of course, is all very bare bones. And yeah, as I said, this is really, really not how we use React in the real world. So we have no modules here. We have no way of converting JSX. We have no HTTP server, which automatically reloads the application, and so on. But again, I still believe that it was quite useful to shortly explore this pure React in this lecture. But of course, now it's time to move on to a more robust and real-world setup. Now, since we are in the first look at React section, let's just take a quick look at React's official documentation that we first opened in the previous lecture. So the official React documentation is at react.dev. And so if you want, you can check out here their landing page and basically get a nice introduction to React. But what we are mostly interested in is here this learn part and the reference part. So here in learn, you have basically some stuff about getting started and some things about the installation, but you will not really need this for now because we will talk about how to set up a React project over the next few lectures. Then down here, you have the section about learning React. So where they basically teach you the very fundamentals of React. Now, since you are watching a React course, that's not going to be super helpful for you, but a few pages that might become helpful are here in this section of escape hatches. So not for now, but really for later. So this page here is really great once we start learning about effects, and the same thing about this page here as well. So I really like these two, and I advise you to read them once we reach the advanced part of UseEffect. So while you're going through the course, I think this is all you might need about this learn section. So we're more interested in here in this reference section. And so here, basically, they explain you every single method or every single function that exists inside React. So for example, the first React hook that we're going to learn in depth is this one here of useState. And so if you then want to learn even more about it or see maybe some other examples that I didn't talk about in the lecture, you can come here to this corresponding page about this useState hook, for example, and then you can read all about what they have to tell you here. Or maybe at some point I will mention the useLayoutEffect function that we will not really go in depth into the course. And so then if you want to really learn what this means, you can click here and learn about it. All right. So you can keep this React documentation open at all times while you're learning. That's actually a good idea because a good developer always knows where to find all the information that they need. And in many cases, that's right in the official documentation. Okay, and that's all for this lecture. And so now let's move on to actually learning about how to set up a real-world React project. So as we just learned, in the real world, we don't just write React apps in a single JavaScript file without any tooling. So let's now learn about the options that we have to set up a brand new React project. And for now, the two most important options are the Create React App tool or a build tool called Vite. So first, Create React App is basically a complete starter kit for React applications that was developed many years ago in order to make it really easy for developers to scaffold new React apps. And what's really nice about this is that all the common development tools are already pre-configured out of the box specifically for React. So an app created with Create React App automatically comes with a development server, Webpack for module bundling, and of course important developer tools which include a linter like ESLint, a code formatter like Prettier, a testing library like Jest, and of course Babel for enabling the latest JavaScript features. Now this all sounds great, but the problem with Create React App is that, as I said in the beginning, it was developed many years ago, and so it uses some slow and kind of outdated technologies under the hood, and in particular the Webpack bundler. So the team behind Create React App has really stopped innovating, and therefore right now the recommendation is to not use Create React App for real-world projects anymore. It is, however, still a perfectly fine way to get started quickly with a new React app for tutorials, courses, or simple experiments. And so, therefore, we will actually use Create React App for most of the course. So for all the small learning projects that we're going to build together. So you might have read all the articles saying that Create React App is dead and that you should never use it again. But that's only true for building real apps. Again, for learning, it's still 100% fine because you will not encounter the problems that large-scale apps will face, like slow refresh times. Now, if you do want to build real-world applications with React, as we will do by the end of the course, then Vite is the perfect choice. Now, Vite is actually quite different from Create React App, as it's basically simply a modern build tool. So a bit like a modern Webpack, but which happens to also contain a starter template for setting up brand new React applications. However, in a React app created with Vite, you will have to manually set up many important developer tools, such as ESLint, Prettier, a testing library, and so on. And the most annoying and painful of those is setting up ESLint to play nice with React. So that can be a bit of work and it can go wrong. And so this is the reason why I still recommend using Create React App for tutorials when we just want to get up and running as quickly as possible. Now, if we have all this additional work to set up our tools, then why even use Vite in the first place? Well, the reason is that it's just extremely fast to automatically refresh the page when the code changes, which is what we call hot module replacement. Also, bundling is extremely fast too, which for large-scale applications can really make a difference. Because when you have to wait 1 or 2 seconds for each page refresh, it can become really annoying over time. But with Vite, the page will update almost instantly each time that we save our code and want to see the changes on the screen. So, in summary, we will use Create React App for most small apps in this course, and then move to Vite for the last 2 or 3 projects to make them a bit more real world and more modern as well. Now, if you have spent any time looking at the React documentation, you might have read that the React team now advises developers to use a so-called React framework like Next.js or Remix to build new projects. So, in fact, we have even more options to set up a new React project than the ones that we just talked about. Now, we're going to talk about what React frameworks are throughout the course. But for now, all you need to know is that a framework like Next.js contains solutions for things like routing, data fetching, and server-side rendering. So things that React itself does not provide easily out of the box. So essentially, a React framework is a framework built on top of the React library, and which is going to make it even easier to build applications than with just vanilla React itself. And this sounds great, right? Well, yeah, it kind of does, but only for some applications. However, many people, and that include me, think that telling developers to always immediately go for a React framework is not the best idea and not always necessary. Vanilla React apps, so apps built only using React, still have a very important place too. And so forcing this opinion on everyone seems kind of strange. But again, we will discuss this later on. Now, in any case, this advice only makes sense for building actual production-ready products, but not for learning React, which is of course what we are trying to do in this course. So even if at some point you want to learn Next.js as well, of course you still need to learn React itself first. So all this is to say that you should not worry about this recommendation for now. For now, let's just learn React and set up new projects with Create React App first, and then with Vite in the bigger projects. And with all this being said, let's now actually go create our very first real React application. Welcome back. So now that we know that we want to use Create React App for small course projects, let's actually set up our very first project now with the Create React App tool. Now, Create React App is a command line interface tool. And so now we need actually a terminal or a command prompt, as it's called on Windows. So if you're on Windows, go ahead and open up your command prompt. And if you're on a Mac, then open up your terminal. Okay, let's make this a bit bigger. And there's not a lot of things that you need to know about the terminal. So all you need to know is that in the terminal, or also in the command prompt, which I'm just going to use interchangeably, you're always in a folder. And that folder is usually displayed here in the command prompt. Now this command prompt here, so this thing probably looks very different for you than it looks for me, but that's just because I have this kind of extension here installed. So for you, it's probably just all black, and most likely you will see the folder that you're currently in here. So I'm currently in this folder, which is basically just the home folder. And you can see the contents of the folder by writing ls on the Mac, and on Windows, the same thing is dir, which stands for directory. So again, with this, you can see the contents of the current directory. So what I want to do now is to navigate to another directory, which is where I ultimately want to run the Create React App tool. So for me, that's the desktop again. And so I can write cd and then the name of the folder and hit enter. And this command is actually the exact same on Windows. So that's also cd. And so make sure that you navigate to the folder in which you want to create the new project. So again, for me, that's on the desktop. And just to make sure, yeah, these are the two folders that are on my desktop, which are exactly these two, right? Now, later on, we will actually use the terminal that is integrated into VS Code, for example, to start and stop the application. But to create an application, we will always keep using this terminal here, because the terminal that's in VS Code is usually tied to the project folder itself. But here we don't have a project folder yet. Instead, we will now create it using Create React App. Once you're in the folder where you want to create the new project, type npx and then create-react app and then the name of the app that you want to build. Now in our case, that's going to be pizza-menu, because this is our very first project that we're going to build in this course in the next section. However, we're not really ready to run this yet, because I want you to actually use the version 5 of Create React App. So please write this @ and then 5 to lock in version 5 of Create React App. And that's important because this tool will most likely change in the future, and then it might work in a slightly different way than the one that I'm showing you here. But in order not to run into any problems, let's just fix this on version 5 for the rest of the course. And then later, if you want to build your own projects outside of the course, you of course no longer need this. Then you will just run Create React App like this without the version number. But here, let's do it like this. So once you have it written like this, just hit enter, and this will then take a long time to download. Well, actually first, it asks me if I want to proceed. So just type Y and then enter or return. And so yeah, now it is starting to download like thousands of packages, which will take a lot of time. But you see it already created the folder with the name of the app that we specified here, so pizza menu. So go ahead and pause the video right now, and I will be back here once downloading all of these packages has finished. Okay, and it's done installing all the packages, and so now we can actually close up this terminal or the command prompt. Now before I open up this folder here, I will quickly rename this folder just so they stay in the order that I want them to be. But this is totally optional. So number 2 will be for the next section. That's why this one is number 3. Okay, and now we're ready to open up this project as our project folder in VS Code. And so once again, I will drag and drop it onto the VS Code icon down here, or optionally, you can also just open a new VS Code window and then open up the project folder right here. But anyway, let's now explore the file structure that has been created for us by Create React App. And we can already see that this is actually just a regular NPM project that we could also have manually created using the npm init command. So we have a package.json file here, which contains the name of the app, the version, the dependencies, and also the npm scripts. Right, and we also have the node modules folder, which is where all the npm packages have been installed. And you see that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of them, but I'm just looking for the React ones here. And yeah, here they are. So here is the React package and here the React DOM package. And remember that these two are exactly the ones that we also included into our file in the pure React lecture, right? But we did it back then using the script tag and of course not using npm install, right? Now, if this whole concept here of the npm project, so this node modules and the package.json is a bit strange for you, then don't worry. You don't really need to understand all that. But if you want, you can just try to read something on it or watch a video, or I also explain it all in my complete JavaScript course. But again, it's not really necessary. Just know that this is a very, very standard and basically all modern JavaScript projects that have a build tool associated. Okay? But anyway, let's now check out these other folders that have been created for us. Now, most of our development work, or basically all development, will happen here inside the source folder. So here we have a bunch of files where most of them we actually don't need, and so we will get rid of them soon. But for now, let's just leave everything here as it is. And checking out the other folder, which is the public folder. And this is where basically all the assets that will end up in the final application go. So all the images, like the fav icon, and also the index.html file. And if we open that up, we have a bunch of stuff here. And well, all of these comments here, which you can read if you want, but I just wanted to draw your attention to this div with the ID of root. So is that familiar to you? Yeah, we wrote exactly the same thing in the pure React lecture and used this as the root of our app. And so exactly the same convention has been used here by create React app. So create React app created this index.html file already for us. And then if we open index.js, you see that here it also selects that root element, so the element with the ID of root, and then it creates the root using React DOM.createRoot and then renders the app into it. So exactly like we did in the pure React lecture. But more about all this at the beginning of the next section when we actually start building this project. For now, I just want to explore the file structure here a little bit. Now, what I do want to say in this video is that all of these files and this entire file structure here has been created by Create React App in a way that its developers thought was best. But it could be all completely different. Like this index.html could be out here, or it could be inside here, or we could maybe have no folders at all, because React really doesn't care about any of that. And the proof for that is that in the pure React lecture, we didn't need any of this, right? All we had was one index.html with some JavaScript in which we basically had this. So this part here is actual React, and it's this part which takes care of rendering this app component into the DOM. So this app component is here inside this app file, but we will open up all of these files and clean them up also once we start actually building the app. For now, I just wanted to explore this a little bit. And also, I actually wanted to now start this app. So to start a Create React app, we can use this npm script right here. So this npm run start. So let's open up the terminal again. But as I said in the beginning, now we will actually use the integrated terminal that comes with VS Code. So for that, open up terminal right here. And now the big advantage here is that we are already automatically inside our project folder. So if we run ls here or dir on Windows, then you will see exactly the same files and folders that we have here in the sidebar. But anyway, now to start the project, all we need to do is to run npm run start, because this is how you run these commands right here. So you write npm run and then the name of one of these four in this case. And we could also create our own, but we don't need to. Now, in the case of the start command, we actually don't even need to write run. We can just type npm start, hit enter, and that will then start up our application and even open up a new browser tab. And there it is. So Create React App created a web server for us and made our application run here on localhost port 3000. Okay, now let's just one more time come back here and open up this app component. So this app component here is inside the app file. And so let's just take everything here and just very quickly type h1 hello react, give it a save. And then once we go back, it should automatically have updated. And indeed, it did. So this was one of the things that we were missing in the pure React lecture. But now here we are actually using a web server. And so we get hot module replacement with that. Great. So congratulations. You just created your very first Create React App application. And with this, we actually reach the end of the first look at React section. Now the next section is a quick review of the essential JavaScript that you need for React, and so you can see if you need any of those lectures. But if not, then just move on right to the next section where we will then start building this pizza menu that we started here to learn all the fundamentals of React. So hopefully I see you there very soon.